So now guys, let's talk about the development of the face and palate. Well, first let's understand that what we already have to go into this topic. Development of face. And what we just talked about, that first pharyngeal arch will give rise to the mandibular. That is, mandibular prominence will come from the first arch. And then mandibular prominence will give rise to the maxilla and zygomatic and so on. That means this portion of the face is derived directly or indirectly from the first pharyngeal arch only. The mandible and the maxilla and the zygomatic part will come from first arch. So if I put my hand on this part here, now look at what is left. The only thing left right now is the forehead and the nose. So the process which will give rise to the forehead and nose is called as a fronto-nasal process. So we need two things for the development of face and even palate also. That is, we need a mandibular prominence or the mandibular process which will give rise to other things. And then there is a process which develops in front of the forebrain. When the neural tube is forming the forebrain, that mesenchyme in front of the forebrain is called as fronto-nasal process. So that's what for the development of face and palate. Okay, so we said we need two things. One is the fronto-nasal process. There's this process called as fronto-nasal process, which is nothing but the developing mesenchyme. It is the developing mesenchyme in front of forebrain. It's a developing mesenchyme in front of the forebrain. And the second component we need for the development of face and palate is the mandibular process, which will obviously come from the first arch. That is a mandibular process. You can call it mandibular process or mandibular prominence. So frontonasal process and mandibular process. This is what we need to understand the development of the face. Now let me just tell you how it is all done. So guys, what we have, let me just go with series of few diagrams here. If this is the frontonasal process, I'll be using some short forms here. That is frontonasal process. And there we have the mandibular process, which was derived from the first arch. Let us start with this one. Frontonasal process and mandibular process. Well, frontonasal process, in the frontonasal process we'll have the development of the lens placard also, and then we have a nasal placard also are there, because the nasal pits will be formed from it. So let us start with that. There is a development of the nasal placards. These are the nasal placards. These are the these ectodermal elevations that you will see on the surface. That is called as a nasal placard. Eventually these nasal placards will form a pit inside, and that will be called as a nasal pit. So this will be something like, this is the frontonasal process, and there will have these nasal pits. Initially they are far apart from each other. Below we have this mandibular process, and mandibular process now starts giving rise to a process that is called as maxillary process. So that's the progression here. This is the nasal pit. Now let us say this is a nasal pit. This process here is called as the maxillary process. There is a maxillary process which obviously we said is derived from the mandibular process. It is derived from the mandibular process. That is a maxillary process. Let me just give it a different color or something. Well, the nasal pits, which are obviously features nasal cavity. Now these nasal pits, they will keep on moving close to each other. So let me draw the one final picture how this overall thing will look like too, when this maxillary process will also fuse with the structures above. Okay, and I'll be using some different color to denote them. So first of all, if this is the nasal pit, which is now kind of close. That's the frontonasal process, guys. Please draw it carefully so that It should be technically correct. This is frontonasal process. And what you see in the frontonasal process, there is a nasal pit. Now they are close to each other. And these nasal pits, they are guarded by, or you can say they are having on each side, they have some prominences called as lateral nasal prominence or process and medial nasal process or prominence. So that's how it goes. This is the lateral nasal process. There is a lateral nasal process or prominence, and the one which is inside, this is a medial nasal process or prominence here. This elevation here is a medial nasal process or prominence. Let me write that. This is the lateral nasal process or prominence. We'll show you one comparative picture from the atlas also. And this is medial nasal process. Part of frontonasal process only, but now these elevations are called as medial nasal process and the lateral nasal process. What is happening below? We already said we have this mandibular process, right? This is the mandibular process. And now mandibular process, we said, will give rise to what? Maxillary process. So what we said, this maxillary process, just make sure to draw it carefully. This is a maxillary process which goes like this and then fuse with the medial nasal process. Obviously, don't leave a gap on the side here. These are the, for which I'm using this yellow highlighter here. This is the maxillary process which is derived from mandibular. As I said, make sure don't leave a gap on the side here. Don't leave a gap on the side. If you leave a gap on the side, that will become a cleft only. So we have this frontonasal process which is having these nasal openings inside, and then we have medial nasal and the lateral nasal process which are guarding these nasal pits, and then maxillary process which is derived from mandibular. This is the one which goes and fuses with the medial nasal. By looking at this picture, we can make out that what is derived from where. And in fact, before that, before I discuss the derivatives of this, we can compare it on one of the image picture I'll show you. So look at this picture from the atlas, guys. This is what you are looking at right now, isn't it? Just compare the picture here. What process is that? That is frontonasal process. You can see the nasal pits inside, guarded by this medial nasal process or prominence, and that is a lateral nasal process. And then you see mandibular process here giving rise to this yellow one, that is maxillary, which is not written here. Let me write that. That is a maxillary process. And that maxillary process ultimately fused with the medial nasal process to form the upper lip. So the question is, what is derived from where? I mean, if you use that, the diagram that you have with you, so we can write that upper lip, lower lip, where all these structures are derived from. So keeping that picture in front, guys, starting with the simplest one, the lower lip. Lower lip. Well, the lower lip is derived from, there's only one thing below, that is mandibular process, right? Lower lip is derived from the mandibular process. Mandibular process. In fact, these are mandibular processes. There are two. We have two, we have pharyngeal arches coming from both the sides. So we have one mandibular process from here and one from here, and then both the mandibular process will fuse in midline. And rarely, if the mandibular process, they fail to fuse in the midline, then they can give rise to the cleft lower lip also. But it's not a very usual thing. It's a rare anomaly to have a cleft lower lip. Usually we have a cleft upper lip. But if it is, even if it is a case of cleft lower lip, you will not have a unilateral cleft lower lip or bilateral cleft lower lip. It will be a midline cleft lower lip only, because it's just because of the non-fusion of the two mandibular process which fails to fuse in the midline. So if I can write that for you. So midline cleft lower lip. Midline cleft lower lip, we said that is because of what? Non-fusion. Non-fusion of mandibular processes. If both the mandibular processes from the right and the left side, if they fail to fuse in the midline, that can give rise to the cleft lower lip, which we said is always in the midline. It's a midline cleft lower lip. Well, the one which is more interesting and important also, that is upper lip. What about upper lip? Guys, upper lip is derived from what? Again, look at the picture here. Upper lip is derived from maxillary process and medial nasal process. It is maxillary and medial nasal process and not the lateral. So upper lip is derived from the maxillary process and the medial nasal process. I'm writing M and P, that is medial nasal process. And if you look at the upper lip, what part of upper lip will be from the medial nasal process? Well, it's the philtrum which is formed by the medial nasal process. The philtrum portion of the upper lip is by the medial nasal process. Now here is something which we need to understand about the cleft upper lip. Now, cleft upper lip can be of different type. If let's say both the medial nasal process are failed to fusing in the midline. If medial nasal process will not fuse in the midline, so we have a midline cleft upper lip. If maxillary process fail to fuse with the medial nasal process, you'll have a unilateral cleft upper lip. And if both maxillary process they fail to fuse with the medial nasal process in the midline, that will lead to the bilateral cleft upper lip, or also called as a hair lip. Upper lip like a rabbit, that is a hair lip. Let me write that anomalies for you. So first we said midline cleft upper lip. Midline cleft upper lip is because of the non-fusion of medial nasal processes. If both these medial nasal processes they don't fuse in the midline, that will give rise to the midline cleft upper lip. Then second condition we have is the unilateral cleft upper lip. Unilateral cleft upper lip is because of the non-fusion of medial nasal process with maxillary process. If there is a non-fusion of medial nasal process and maxillary process, that will give rise to the unilateral cleft upper lip, which will be seen exactly on the side of the philtrum here, because philtrum is by the medial nasal process. And then we also have the condition that is a bilateral cleft upper lip, which is, as I said, is also called as the hair lip. And this bilateral cleft upper lip is because of the non-fusion of, it is a non-fusion of both medial nasal processes to maxillary processes. When both these maxillary process and medial nasal process they don't fuse with each other, then it will give rise to bilateral cleft upper lip, or also called as a hair lip. And what is derived from, I mean, this is about the anomaly, what is derived from the lateral nasal process? We didn't talk about the lateral nasal process yet. That will give rise to what? Ala of the nose. So guys, the ala of nose is derived from the lateral nasal process. Now there's one important anomaly that we need to understand here. We talked about the cleft lower lip, we talked about the cleft upper lip in the midline, unilateral cleft upper lip, bilateral cleft upper lip, right? Now what about, in fact, I show you the picture first and then I want you to think about it. Guys, what is the reason or the cause behind the anomaly which I'm showing you in this picture here? Look at that. I put 4 options for you here. The question is, look at this picture, and the question is that the following condition is because of what? I mean, what is the reason for behind this, the following anomaly? Just take like 30 seconds and look at all these options and see what should be the right answer. Now, if you're thinking the right answer to this question is C, then you are actually going wrong, because C is not the right answer, guys. C says it's a fusion of maxillary process to medial nasal process, non-fusion of maxillary. Non-fusion of maxillary and medial nasal process gives rise to only cleft upper lip. This is not the case of cleft upper lip only. It is actually facial cleft. This is a condition of the facial cleft. The condition is actually called as the oblique facial cleft. You can write that in your notes. You will get this image in your soft copies. That is oblique facial cleft. And what you see in the oblique facial cleft, guys, it is actually because of, see, ala of the nose, we already said this is the ala of the nose, right? We already know that ala of the nose is derived from what? Lateral nasal process. And this here, that is the maxillary process. So when the maxillary process is not even able to reach the ala of the nose, or you can say till the lateral nasal process, forget about medial, medial is more inside. If it is not even able to reach this lateral nasal process, then it's not only the cleft upper lip, it will be a cleft which will be seen on the side of the face. And what is important to see here, if it would have been the case of the cleft upper lip, let's say if it would have been the case of upper lip, then it should be on the side of the philtrum. It should be somewhere here. But no, it's not. It should be on the side of the philtrum. It is more laterally placed. So this is a condition called as oblique facial cleft. And what is the reason behind the oblique facial cleft? And see, one more thing before I go to the reason. In oblique facial cleft, what is not formed? It is a nasolacrimal duct which is not formed. Nasolacrimal duct is formed when these processes fuse with each other and then the duct is absorbed inside. But you can see this is an exposed nasolacrimal duct also. We have an exposed nasolacrimal duct as well. So be it oblique facial cleft or exposed nasolacrimal duct, it's the same thing. And the condition is because of this. Please note that is a failure of fusion of maxillary process to the medial nasal process. That's the right answer. Failure of fusion of maxillary process to the medial nasal process. That is the right answer to this question. And it's not because of the maxillary process to medial nasal process. So lateral nasal process, when the ala of the nose forming process not fused, that lead to the oblique facial cleft in which the nasolacrimal duct, as you can see in the picture, is exposed on the surface. This is about the development of the face. Now, what about palate? If we know the development of the face, then palate is no big deal, guys. Upper lip is derived from the maxillary process and medial nasal process. And same maxillary and medial nasal process will give off extensions inside, and that will give rise to the palate only. So when it comes to the development of palate, there is nothing new or special in that. Let me write that for you. So in the development of palate, if I see the palate from the under surface, look at this. That is a view of the palate from the under surface. What we know that for the upper lip, these two components were there. One is the maxillary process. So you're looking at the maxillary process from the under surface. And the one which is in the midline, that is the medial nasal process. If this is a medial nasal process, or you can say that is the frontonasal process simply. Medial nasal process comes from the frontonasal process. So you may see frontonasal process written at certain places. That is a frontonasal process part. And the one on the side here, that is a maxillary process, which is derived from mandibular. This is the maxillary process. Now, both these processes, frontonasal, or you can say frontonasal process and maxillary process, they will give some shelf-like structure inside. So from the medial nasal process, you will see an extension like this, and this extension from the frontonasal process, this is called as the premaxilla. That is called as a premaxilla. I'm just writing with the same color only, the green one, that is premaxilla. Whereas maxillary process, on the other hand, will give rise to the palatine process, which will develop and move towards each other like this. The one I'm putting a dots on it, this is the palatine process which is derived from the maxillary process. These are the palatine process. So basically you just need to know that where they're originating from. These terms are not very important, the premaxilla and palatine process. So frontonasal process and the maxillary process, whatever is giving rise to the upper lip, the same is contributing to the formation of palate also. So premaxilla and the palatine process. Both of them will give rise to the palate. But what exactly is coming from the premaxilla? Well, obviously, palatine process is the larger process, and they will form the maximum part of the palate. Even the main palatine bone will come from this palatine process. But when it comes to this part, that is the most anterior part, or you can say the incisive portion of the palate. So premaxilla will give rise to the incisive part of the palate. Incisive part of the palate is by the premaxilla, and palatine process will give rise to the rest of the palate. Rest of the palate is by the palatine process of the maxilla. And you know, when they will fuse with each other, I mean, this is obviously, this all will be fused. Once they are fused, the foramen which will be formed here, or the fossa which will be there at the junction of all these three, that will be called as the incisive fossa. That will give rise to the incisive fossa. It will be behind the upper incisor, so we call it incisive fossa, through which, you know, the greater palatine artery which goes inside and supplies the contributes to the Kiehlbeck's plexus. That incisive fossa will be there at the junction of this premaxilla and this palatine process of the maxilla. So this is about the palate. And what about the muscles of the palate, guys? I mean, this is the palate, we're talking about the connective tissue, the bones. What about the muscles of the palate? We already said, and in the previous discussion, that muscles of the palate and even pharynx, they're derived from the fourth pharyngeal arch. So muscles of palate are derived from the fourth pharyngeal arch only, except tensor veli palatini, which will come from the first arch. So just to write that thing once again in the palate part. So regarding the muscles, the muscles of palate are derived from the fourth pharyngeal arch, vago-accessory complex, that is from the fourth pharyngeal arch. If you turn back pages, and you will see that fourth pharyngeal arch, except tensor veli palatini, which we said is derived from the first arch. So that's where the muscles of the palate will develop from. Fourth arch, except the first one, the tensor veli palatini will come from the first arch because it is supplied by mandibular nerve. So this is about the development of the face and the palate, and what other structures those processes will give rise to. One important thing to summarize this, whatever we discussed in this section, we said medial nasal processes contributing to so many things, guys. Medial nasal processes giving rise to the philtrum of the upper lip. Now we saw medial nasal process forming this incisive portion of palate. So what all is derived from the medial nasal process? Actually, whatever you see in the midline here, this is all coming from medial nasal process only, isn't it? So if I just have to write down the derivatives of medial nasal process, let us say if the question is asked, what are the derivatives of medial nasal process? So that will include the tip of nose, that will include the columella, that will include the philtrum of the upper lip, and that will also include the incisive portion. Incisive portion of palate. Incisive portion of palate. They are all derived from the medial nasal process. The tip of the nose, the columella, the philtrum, and we just said that the incisive portion of palate is also derived from the medial nasal process. So this is about the development of the face and palate. In the next and the third and the last section of this H&F development, we will talk about the development of the tongue and the thyroid gland also.